Good morning. Is this on loud enough this morning? Good. Today's lecture is a little bit different than any of the others I've done. Usually I'm talking about someplace in Latin America where I have my experience. Today, I don't have much experience about the San Joaquin Valley. I've only lived there for the last 52 years. Actually, when I went to Fresno State in 1970, I intended to stay a year or two, and somehow I ended up there for 41 years. But San Joaquin Valley is oftentimes referred to as the world's richest agricultural area. And it's part of what is referred to as the Central Valley, which runs for about 400 miles from the far north to the far south, and is typically about 50 miles wide. It's usually divided into two halves. The northern half is the river valley of the Sacramento, and the southern half is the valley of the San Joaquin River, along with others. So we're really talking today about the southern part of that. And you see there I put in the Bay Area, San Francisco area, up there at the top, or at this top center. This is a map of the geology of Central or all of California, and the area that we're talking about is that area there, San Joaquin Valley. And here's a geologic map. Again, it's the southern half of that area that we're talking about today. This is an old map, dates to 1871. It's of the San Joaquin Valley from the far part north up at the Bay Area up at the top left. There are the names of some of the counties there. They're probably not readable, but you can perhaps see Stanislaus County. I was told to mention Stanislaus County. I've done that. We're good. Merced County, Madera County wasn't even in existence in those days. It split off from Fresno County. Fresno County is there a little south of Center and down to a couple of the other counties, Tulare, Kings, and Kern County in the far south. This again, a 1871 map. The black area is some land that was being sold. There was a company there that was selling land. But also in this map, you can see two parallel black lines running through the map, and those were railroads. The railroads were being built in the early 1870s, opened up the east side of the valley. Here again, a map. I don't have a date for this one, but apparently it is from the early 1870s. We can tell that because the one railroad that's there stops about here. But it's a nice map. I like to point out a couple of different things, and I want to talk a little bit about history using this map. The Spanish really did not do anything in the San Joaquin Valley or the Central Valley. They were along the coast. They had their King's Highway that was running between missions all the way up to the Sacramento or to the San Francisco area. The interior of California was still basically Indian country. The Native Americans were still dominant in the 1800s and into the gold rush period, 1848-49. Certainly before then, the Indians had been decimated by European diseases and also by attempts by the Spanish missions to go inland and round up the Indians and take them over to the coastal missions and turn them into good Christians, good dead Christians. But you can see a couple of things on this map that I think are important for our story. Right in the middle there, you see a big lake. That lake, Tulare Lake, does not exist today. It was a lake that was fed by some of the rivers in the south end of the valley. The Indians made tremendous use of that lake. It had lots of different resources, including fish like salmon. It had deer and elk. It had bird life that was extensive there. The Indians in the Central Valley really made use of two different sets of resources. They made use of valley floor resources, and Tulare Lake area was typical. They also were up in the hills. The foothills of the San Joaquin Valley were among the most densely populated Native American areas in what is today the United States. The coastal ranges to the west and the foothills on the east side had very large numbers of Native Americans. And the interesting thing is they were not agriculturalists. We did have agriculturalists in the United States, particularly in the area around Phoenix, Hopi in New Mexico and so forth were farmers. But in this area, they were not farmers, but they did depend on an extremely dependable food crop, and that is acorns from the oak trees. The oak trees were very productive, and acorns store well, so that at the end of an acorn harvest, the Indians would know that they had a year's food supply or even multi-year food supply that was dependable, and therefore they could have a fairly dense population, denser than most other parts of the United States. When the Europeans began to come in, they settled mainly on the east side of the valley. Certainly the European settlements were greater to the north of the area that's shown on this map, up near Sacramento, which is where the gold rush started, although what we refer to as the mother lode country extends all the way down to about Fresno. And I'm going to throw in a few names of towns here, just because some of these places existed by 1870 or so, and then it became important places today. But the gold rush is really from Fresno on north, from the San Joaquin River on north. Fresno dates from there. The earliest town in this particular area, the map, was Visalia. Visalia dates from about the late 1840s or early 1850s. Tulare is still an important town today. Delano, not so important, but it was the end of the railroad on this particular map. And then at the south end of the valley, the biggest city today is Bakersfield. Fresno is by far the largest urban area in the San Joaquin Valley. The city of Fresno is a little over 500,000 population. I live out in the countryside. My mailing address is Clovis, California. When I moved to Fresno area in 1970, Clovis had about 10,000 people. Today, the city of Clovis has about 130,000 people. So it has been growing very much in the last 50 years. But those are some of the towns of the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley. Here's another map that is important for us. I want to point out just a couple of features on this one. The main one is the Sierra Nevada mountains on the east side of the valley. This is the geologically newest mountain range in what is today the United States, and also has some of the highest peaks. Mount Whitney, the highest peak in the 48 states, is due east of Fresno. There's where San Francisco is, and I'm also putting in here the Coast Range. So the valley is bordered on the east by the Sierra Nevada and on the west by the Coast Ranges. The other thing that's important about this is that you see the Sierra Nevada are shown there mainly in white, and the name of the mountain range, Sierra Nevada, simply means snowy mountains. It is that snow in those mountains that makes agriculture in this valley possible. So here's a photo flying over the mountains. I've taken a variety of pictures flying east from Fresno, headed off to Dallas or Phoenix, and you see this in the wintertime. That snow is what is going to melt in the spring and summer and bring irrigation water down to the valley floor. Many of you maybe have been in Yosemite. We have actually 3 national parks in the Fresno area. Yosemite to the north, Sequoia and Kings Canyon to the east. And there's these wonderful views of Yosemite in the wintertime. In Kings Canyon National Park, the biggest tree is the General Grant tree. It's supposedly the second largest tree in the world. And it's also referred to as the nation's Christmas tree. There it is again. I love taking people up to Kings Canyon and see this. It's an easy, about 50-minute drive from where I live. Here's a couple of pictures in the wintertime of the Sierra Nevada. I took that one, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago. And I took this one a little bit earlier than that. That's my son and daughter, and my son is 48 years old, which gives you a sense as to when this picture was taken. About 40 years ago. I think he was about 7 in that picture. Notice that the snow is like twice the depth of a person. Well, it's twice the depth of a 7-year-old, but deep snow. We don't have that anymore. The last 20 or 22 years have been a long drought in Central California, and we don't have much snow in the mountains these days. But that snow will melt and will go down through a series of rivers down into the valley floor. And the major rivers of the Central Valley are the ones shown here in kind of blue-green. This is on the San Joaquin River, just to the north of Fresno. There's a dam called the Friant Dam, and the lake behind it is called Millerton Lake, and coming off of the Friant Dam is what is called the Friant-Kern Canal that I'll be talking about in just a few minutes. There's a view of the Friant-Kern Canal today, and here is it when it was being built. Many of these dams were built in the 1930s or very early 1940s. The Friant-Kern Canal, for example, was not finished all the way into 1948, I think. But they were basically projects that started during the Great Depression to a certain extent as make-work projects. And here's a photo of the dam being constructed, and this is one of the camps that was set up for workers brought in to help build the dam. This map shows a series of the dams. The dams in the northern part of California actually are not much used in the Sacramento Valley. Sacramento Valley has more rainfall and doesn't really need all that water. So what they do these days, at least from the 1970s on, they take water from some of those northern dams, like Shasta Dam, and bring it down to Southern California or the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley. So we're actually now taking water from Northern California and bringing it all the way to Southern California. This is Millerton Lake, which is behind the Friant Dam. It's damming up the San Joaquin River. You can see kind of the snow-capped mountains in the distance. On the east side of the valley, the major aqueduct is the Friant-Kern Canal. It runs for 152 miles from that dam all the way down to the Kern River in downtown Bakersfield, California, 152 miles long. If some of you would like to see a video of that movie sometime, I have videoed the Friant-Kern Canal. Now, you may think, videoed the canal. I have videoed 152 miles of the Friant-Kern Canal, taking it roughly between 8 and 10 minutes per mile to do the whole thing. So if you multiply 8 or 10 minutes times 152, we'd probably go over our time limit this morning. And you might say, why in the world did you do that? The last 7 years that I was a professor, starting in 2004 and finishing when I retired in 2011, I was doing a project for the Federal Bureau of Reclamation, which owns and runs the Friant-Kern Canal. It's a federal dam, federal project. And as part of that project, we did film the entire canal. The other big canal that I want to mention here is the California Aqueduct. It was built in the 1970s and takes water from Northern California, from Shasta Dam, brought down the Sacramento River, and then transferred via some other canals to the California Aqueduct. And the California Aqueduct actually ends up taking water all the way down to Los Angeles and Southern California. So here's the Friant-Kern Canal. Again, I've got thousands of pictures of the Friant-Kern Canal taken over a period of 7 years, but this is right near the dam, and this is a little bit farther south, and we're going south. Again, you can see the nice snow-capped mountains in the distance, and here it is going along. We're going to look at agriculture in a minute. The other canal on the west side of the valley is the California Aqueduct, and this is a picture of the California Aqueduct, actually fairly far to the north, up I think in Merced County. And this is the California Aqueduct in western Fresno County. Takes a lot of water down to Southern California. This is land use in the San Joaquin Valley. It's dated, I think, 2016. The red areas are urban areas, and you can see Fresno there in the north and Bakersfield in the far south and a variety of other towns along the way. Again, Modesto and Merced are up there a little bit farther north, and Madera and Visalia and so forth down farther south. Also, you can see some blue areas. Those are the remains of wetlands. Back before white settlement, before European American settlement, say before 1850 or so, there was a lot of wetland in the San Joaquin Valley. Most of those areas have been drained. A few are preserved. Many of them are federally managed. Some of them have been in the news over the last 30 or 40 years. There's one called the Kesterson area because water was draining into it that contained a lot of selenium, and the selenium was killing the birds, and it was a big controversy because of the pollution brought in by the wastewater from irrigated fields. The green areas are the agricultural areas, and that's what we want to focus in on today. And I'm mainly going to be talking about areas in and around Fresno, because I know Fresno County better than the others. If we were to look at the valley as north-south and then proceed on a transect from the east to west, closest up to the Sierra Nevada would be a zone of citrus trees. Typically oranges, but also to a certain extent lemons and a little bit of grapefruit, things like that. And there are several different reasons why that became the citrus zone, the major one being air drainage. Cold air is heavier than warm air, and cold air sinks to the lowest part of the valley. And so there is, during cold nights in the wintertime, a movement of air from the hills, cold air, flowing down the hillsides down to the lowest part of the valley. And in citrus, which are very frost sensitive, you have that movement of air or the warmest possible air. Prior to the mid-1970s, the farmers used what are called smudge pots. They were simply burners that would be out in the field. They'd light these things on fire. They were throwing up a lot of smoke and smudge, and that would keep the fields from freezing. In the 70s, that sort of thing was outlawed federally. And so what you have today is that you have to figure out other ways around that. If you do get a hard frost, and particularly one that will last a couple of nights in a row or get temperatures below about 26 degrees, the citrus there, the growing fruits, will be ruined. And this is a map, or this is a chart. It dates from 1988 to 2002, so it's a while ago. But there's a couple of things on this chart that I want to point out. Citrus really came in a big way beginning in the 1920s and 1930s. So by the time of this chart, in the 80s and 90s, many of the trees were old. The yellow line is depicting the number of boxes, each one weighing about 37, almost 40 pounds per tree that the trees were producing. And you'll notice that over that 20-year period, or 14-year period, the production per tree was going down as the trees were getting older and older. The other thing is, you notice on the blue line, that's the actual production per tree, per area, and it's in million cartons. Some years, the number is way, way down. Those were years when there was a hard freeze. A hard freeze will be a disaster for citrus because if it's bad enough, there's nothing much you can do. There are a few things you can do, and we see that in this picture. You're not really picking it up, but near the center, there's a kind of a line of white poles, or you see it there in the center. What those are wind machines, and they can turn those on at night and generate some airflow, trying to push the cold air down towards the lower part of the valley, and that little bit of air movement will help protect the citrus from freezing. There's a nice orange tree. Here's again the wind machines. There is one big problem, and that is if you live near an orange grove, these things make a lot of noise at night. My house used to be next to a 20-acre orange grove. They took out the oranges and shut off the machine. But the first years that I lived there, it was very, very noisy at night, on cold nights. There again, these wind machines. There's oranges being picked. They have to be picked manually. People are out in the field on ladders picking, and then they go into processing plants like this, packing plants. They are scattered all up and down the valley out in these agricultural areas. And the oranges will be brought in. They are sorted. Any ones that look bad will be put aside and then packed up and sent off. There's another line or belt of trees west of the citrus belt. It's basically the stone fruit trees, particularly peaches and nectarines and plums and things like that. They can withstand the cold nights. In fact, they need the cold nights to set fruit. this time of year, or at least a little bit earlier, before I got on this ship back in February, the stone fruit belt here is very, very popular for tourists. We actually have a promotion of what they call the Blossom Trail, and people come from Southern California or the Bay Area to travel through the stone fruit area, and the different kinds of trees, plums, nectarines, peaches, have different colored blossoms, and it's a very pretty area. And again, they'd have to be harvested manually by hand and then go into a packing house. West of that is a zone that used to be basically grapes. And the typical grape in the central San Joaquin Valley was a grape called Thompson Seedless. It's a little green berry on the grape. This one is along the San Joaquin River. In fact, the top left there, that's the San Joaquin River. I took that one flying over in the early 80s, late 70s, I think. This I took on the Fresno State campus. Again, you can see the hills in the background. And this is typical in the Fresno area grapes. Back in the 1870s and 1880s, settlement really began of farmers in the San Joaquin Valley on the east side. Prior to that, if there was any farming, it was large scale for dry farming of mainly hay and wheat and things like that, or they were raising cattle and sheep, and they were big farms. But those began to be broken up and sold off as relatively small farms, perhaps 100 acres, maybe even smaller than that, sometimes maybe 160 acres. But the east side of the valley typically had relatively small farms. Here's the caption on this photo, and these captions are from the UC Berkeley photo archive, and it says this is a 20-acre colony farm. There were a lot of colonies where settlers from Scandinavia or Armenians or from various other areas would come in and settle together. Literally on a 20-acre grape farm, you could make a living. This is, again, Thompson Seedless. The growers of Thompson Seedless always had three different ways to sell their grapes. They could sell them as fresh fruit on the fresh market. They could hold them and make them into raisins, or they could sell them for wine. And the farmer was always trying to balance which one am I going to get the most money for. The riskiest one, the one that would bring the most money, was making raisins like this. But raisins typically are not made until mid-September, early October, when you have the risk of rain. And raisins are made, sun-made, out on the ground. You pick the grapes and put them on a tray on the ground, and then the sun literally dries them. Halfway through the process, you have to turn them over and dry the other side. But you always have a risk of the 8 or 10 days when those grapes are drying on the ground. If there's rain, you're going to have a big problem. The grapes will get moldy. They'll get dirt on them. That's going to be a problem. But these are going to be sun-made raisins. And this is packing fresh grapes, table grapes, or here, company that you may have heard of, headquartered in Selma, California, Sun-Made Raisins. It's actually a cooperative of Sun-Made growers. And here is inside the Sun-Made plant of checking for quality, picking out the bad ones, and then boxing them up. And again, you probably have seen Sun-Made raisins. I have seen Sun-Made raisins at the markets in Europe. I've seen them in various places in South America, or all over the United States. You can also make wine. The San Joaquin Valley has not been known in the past as a wine area. The Thompson Seedless grapes can produce wine, but it's going to be very, very low quality wine. You may have heard of one of the companies that was headquartered in the San Joaquin Valley called Gallo, and the low-end Ripple wines and things like that, Thunderbird, etc., were what you would make from Thompson Seedless. These days, things are getting better. There are a lot of small wineries producing quality wines, but it's just something that's been coming in. The better wines have always been from Napa Sonoma or over in Paso Robles and the Central Coast area. Then there's another area that we can refer to as simply the west side. The west side of the valley And this is an area that did not have much in the way of agriculture until the big projects like the California Aqueduct came in the 1970s. Prior to that, beginning in the teens and 20s of the past century, some farmers began to put in deep wells, because the water table is quite low here, put in deep wells and use that for irrigation. But the west side of the valley was never much noted as being much of an agricultural area, except for dry farming of things like wheat or oats, barley, or raising of cattle and sheep. The one crop that began to come in with irrigated land and with pumped water was cotton. And in 1970, cotton was the number one product in the San Joaquin Valley, at least in Fresno County. I take that, you have to say Fresno County here. But that's cotton just about ready to be harvested. Here's an old picture from 1940 from the UC Berkeley photo archives of cotton. And that one doesn't come out very well. This is an interesting graph. It takes from 1920 up to basically 2000, 80-year period. Now, down at the bottom you have the years, and what I need to point out is on the far left side, the first two parts of that are from 1920 to 1960. So the first inch or two of the left-hand side of this graph is the 40-year period, and from 1960 to 2000 is everything else. So the first part of that side, the far left side where it's going up sharply, you got to remember that's a 40-year period of sharpness, and then the rest of it, the peaks and valleys, is over the second 40-year period. But it started out very low and around 19-teens and 20s when some farmers began to put in wells on the west side and start to raise cotton, and then went up very sharply. There was a change, and notice the blue versus the red. They started to introduce a new type of higher quality cotton, Pima cotton, long staple cotton, in about the mid-1980s, and then that became more productive. But if we were to continue this chart, and I don't have the chart for anything past 2000, if we were to continue that chart, it would drop very precipitously, because cotton is not an important crop in Fresno County these days. Back in the 20s and 30s, there was a need for labor. Cotton was picked by hand, and first bringing in blacks from the south part of the United States and Mexicans from Mexico. During the Second World War, braceros, Mexicans brought in temporarily. And then also large numbers of people in the 1930s coming in from what we call the Dust Bowl. John Steinbeck and the Grapes of Wrath and so forth. That migration of people from Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska was into the San Joaquin Valley. Labor were needed for the fruit trees harvesting and for the cotton harvest. So you get these pictures, actually classic pictures, many of these from Life magazine, of the Dust Bowl refugees coming into the San Joaquin Valley. Here, a mule-drawn wagon bringing cotton into one of the cotton gins. Notice it's the Boswell cotton gin. The Boswells were tremendously large landowners in what used to be Tulare Lake bed. They had drained the lake. The dams were no longer letting water go in there, and the Boswells made use of that rich agricultural land, became one of the biggest, most important families back in the 70s and 80s. Here's weighing cotton. And more recently, in the 70s and 80s, it was no longer being harvested by hand. It was now mechanically harvested. This is a fellow that Larry Turnquist here had a farm called Airways Farms out at 5 Points on the west side of Fresno County. And these are pictures at his farm harvesting the cotton. Notice here they're dumping the cotton into a large trailer. They would take that into a cotton gin. And notice also there's a guy standing up there on top of the cotton. And there's a close-up on him. He's quite distinctive in terms of dress, particularly the headdress. He is a Sikh from the Punjab, northwestern India. And the San Joaquin Valley has large numbers of Sikhs that came in, worked originally in agriculture. Now they've gone into other occupations like trucking and things like that. But in some of the small towns on the west side, there are a number of Sikh temples these days. There's dumping the cotton into a press, compress out in the fields. Back in the 70s, there was not enough room in the cotton gins to process all the cotton rapidly. And so what they would do is they put it into machines like this, and then they leave these blocks of cotton out in the field until they could have space in the cotton gin to be able to process it. So you used to see these blocks of cotton out in the fields, and then you'd see in many of the small towns would have a cotton gin. This one is now closed. Cotton is pretty much gone. That's an old photo of one of the cotton gins. Anderson Clayton. I think this one was farther north in, I think, Madera County or Merced County. In the old days, if you go back to the 1890s, early 1900s, before they had much irrigation, it was basically farming out there on huge scale, dry farming of things like wheat and oats and barley. So these are all real old pictures. I actually didn't notice before the Harris sign there. Harrises are still big farmers on the west side. Big machines still being used on the west side. Anybody want to guess what that machine is doing? Notice there are a lot of people up on it and doing various work on the machine as it's running through the field. Any guesses at all? Garlic. Fresno County, 70% of U.S. garlic comes from Fresno County. Almost all the U.S. garlic comes from the San Joaquin Valley. You may have heard of Gilroy as the garlic capital of the world. Gilroy is over on the coast area. Can't remember what county that is, but Gilroy may be the harvesting place, the processing place. Still today, as you drive past the processing plants over there in Gilroy, it smells of garlic, but the garlic is coming from the San Joaquin Valley and being loaded into a big truck and then taken off to Gilroy. Also, here's a machine harvesting another thing there on the west side, big industrial scale ag. This is tomatoes. And tomatoes would then be taken into various processing plants. This one is, I think, in Mendota, California. And it's tomatoes not for table use, it's for making things like pizza sauce and processed tomatoes. I took this picture back in the late 70s, flying over in a small plane. This was the Spreckels sugar plant, and sugar beets used to be a big crop, particularly on the west side. And this is Spreckels from down on the ground, and it also is no longer there. Sugar beets are no longer an important crop. Here's a photo from 1912 down in Visalia of a sugar beet factory, but they're gone. Also on the west side, there is quite a bit of livestock. This is Harris Ranch, John Harris's place, and a few cows there, few head. Typical day, roughly 35,000 head on this place. It's a feedlot producing, sending the cattle into Harris Packing, and Harris Ranch beef is sold throughout the United States. Okay, we used to have dairy. When I first went to Fresno, I took this picture in the early 70s. This was the #1 dairy in Fresno County, the Rao Dairy, roughly 300 cows. Today in Fresno County, or particularly in the counties just to the south, in Tulare County, which is the #1 milk producer in the state of California, or Kings County, a small dairy is 3,000 cows. And you think of milking cows twice a day, morning and night, the old traditional way of doing it. At these big dairies, they have like a merry-go-round. And the cows walk onto the merry-go-round and are hooked up, and then they take about 20 minutes to go all the way around, and they get off on the other side. And all 24 hours a day, cows are going in. Twice a day, each cow is being milked, and it's a continuous process. It is a problem for people who live near these places because they have tremendous odor problems, fly problems, and groundwater problems with the pollution from the cows. But huge, massive dairies. And it's also an interesting story. Those dairymen, many of who are from the Netherlands, at least their families were, started out in the San Fernando Valley on the north side of Los Angeles back in the 19-teens and 20s and 30s. And as the San Fernando Valley urbanized in the 30s and 40s and 50s, those people moved their dairies, sold out at good money, and were able to build bigger dairies on the eastern side of Los Angeles, out in Corona, out in Riverside County or San Bernardino County, on the east side of the Los Angeles basin. And then as those areas urbanized in the 80s and 90s and into the early 2000s, they sold out again for big money and were able to come up into the San Joaquin Valley and build huge, huge dairies and bring that process up to us. So you go out there and you see these huge dairy farms particularly in Tulare County, but also parts of Tulare, Fresno and Kings County. And it's all going mainly to processing. Much of it goes to Los Angeles as raw milk, or it's turned into things like butter and cheese and so forth in the San Joaquin Valley. This is Land O'Lakes. All right, it's not a real good map, but you can kind of see a series of counties, and I have to always mention Stanislaus County is on the map. San Joaquin County is up almost to Sacramento, and Merced, then Madera, Fresno, Tulare, Kings, Kern County. Four of those counties, Fresno number 1, Tulare usually number 2, Kings and Kern either 3 or 4 or 5. In the top 5 counties in the United States for agricultural production, 4 of them are Fresno County on south. Now, also I have to tell you, that's cheating because those are big counties. If you take a county in Texas and compare it to the size of a county in California, these California counties are much, much larger than any single county in many other states or most other states. So that kind of skews the figures. But this is a very, very productive area. This is for Fresno County from 1996 to 2015, the total dollar production of agriculture in Fresno County. Starting in 1996, a little over $3 billion. Up at the top there, 2015, right around $6,606,000,000. The 2001 figure is slightly over $8 billion. It keeps going up and up and up every year. Number 1 county in the United States, Fresno County, a little over $8 billion of agricultural production. But things have changed. These are some statistics I did find for 2000 versus 1970, and I came to Fresno in 1970. In 2000, the number 1 product in Fresno County, number 1 crop, was almonds, a little over $1 billion. Notice the number of acres of almonds in 2020 versus 1970, 50-year period. In 1970, 6,000 acres versus 270,000 acres, an increase in acreage by a factor of 40. Number 2, grapes. They had been big for a long, long time. For over 100 years, grapes have been big in Fresno County. And the number of acres is roughly the same size, although the value of the crop is much higher these days. Things cost more, and you sell your product for more. Pistachios, again, minimal acreage back in 1970, gone up by a factor of over 100 times. And the value has gone up by a huge number. If you take almonds and pistachios together, they're over $2 billion, and we could add in another tree crop, walnuts, into that. It's not a big crop in Fresno, but it's bigger in other valley counties. Garlic, we already talked about, and garlic went from a relatively minor crop to being a major crop these days. Tomatoes, not huge. Oranges, citrus, the number of acres is up by a factor of 3, but the value is gone up by a factor of about 40 times, almost 40 times. Peaches, the number of acres not too much different, but the value of the crop has gone up. Mandarins were not reported as a separate crop in 1970, but they're now huge and coming on strong. I'll talk about them in a little bit. And plums, one of the other stone fruits. So we have peaches and plums as 2 of those stone fruits on the east side of the valley. 3 of the crops that were in the top 10 list, including the number 1 crop from 1970, cotton, are no longer on the top 10 list. Alfalfa and barley off the list. We have a horse ranch. We buy a lot of alfalfa hay. Our alfalfa hay comes from Nevada. It's not grown locally. So things have changed. This is a picture, actually, I took on from I-5, this is, again, a tree crop, but one we haven't seen pictures of before, except the beginning one. These are almonds. And almonds have gone from being almost a nothing crop in 1970 to being #1 in Fresno County and elsewhere in the valley. Lots and lots of almonds. This is part of the, what we call the Blossom Trail. The local Chamber of Commerce and tourist people promote it, and people come in to look at the blossoms of almonds, peaches, nectarines, plums, etc. And I took these pictures about the week or 2 weeks before coming on this cruise, as I realized I was going to do this part of the cruise as well as the first one that I was on, and I figured I'd better get this lecture ready, and so I went out and took these pictures just about 4.5 weeks ago. Absolutely wonderful. You might notice here the boxes, those are bees. Every nut needs to be pollinated. The flower has to be pollinated, and bees are brought into the San Joaquin Valley for a variety of crops, but mainly for almonds. They're brought in from as far away as Montana. They truck in trailers of bees, put them to work in our area. There's the nut. Every one of those nuts takes a gallon of water to produce. 1 gallon of water per nut. We're in the midst of a drought. One of the big advantages of almonds as compared to some of the other tree crops, particularly things like oranges or peaches or nectarines or whatever, is that they're mechanically harvested. Machine comes in, shakes the tree, the almonds fall down onto the ground or into this hopper thing on the tractor, and are then being able to take off for processing. And they're loaded here by a conveyor belt into the hoppers, the trailers, and then they're taken off to one of a variety of almond processing plants. This one is about a mile from our ranch, and so I drive past it almost every day. And out back, you see these stacks and stacks of stuff. Those are not almonds. Those are the almond hulls, the covering over the nut, and they're stacked up here. They're out there for 6 or 8 months. The piles gradually go down. What they do is take those and grind them up and feed them to cows. We've got lots of cows these days. Those are almonds bagged up, ready to go to market. And where are they going? 2/3 of the almonds in California are going to China or other areas, India, Europe. 2/3 of the almonds are exported, 1/3 are used here. We are exporting our water from the San Joaquin Valley. And the reason that's a problem is that we're in the midst of a drought. 20-some years now, we have not had an adequate snowfall up in the mountains. You see where the almond production is, and you see where the drought is. We have been overdrafting water. We're pumping water. There are some areas in the San Joaquin Valley that have gone down, have collapsed by 10 feet or more. The Frying Kern Canal that I studied, one of the reasons we were studying it is because they have a big problem. It is sinking, and it's hard to have water in a canal, in a sinking canal, because water likes to find the lowest spot. Hard to get the water all the way down to Bakersfield these days. What's happening is some people are taking out their almonds. The problem with so many of these crops, like almonds and pistachios and the tree fruits, trees have to be watered every year. When we had cotton as the major crop, if we had a drought, you didn't plant cotton. You got money from the federal government for not planting. Trees you have to water every year. And so what they've been doing is taking out a lot of the trees. One last one here. Anybody know what this is? Not marijuana. That's another one of our big crops, but not listed on the thing. What's going on here? Avocados? No. Protection from birds? Not really. Those are mandarin oranges, seedless mandarins. Why are they seedless? Because the bees didn't get to them. And if you can keep the bees away from your mandarin trees, you get seedless mandarins, like that. And then you can market them as seedless, easy to peel mandarins. They are becoming a very big crop. As a person living in the San Joaquin Valley, I hate these things. And we've got them growing near us because who is producing those? Rich lawyers from Los Angeles, doctors from San Francisco, corporate agriculture. It is not the local farmer who is raising mandarins. It is all corporate. One of the richest people in California is big in these things. I think that's his brand there of cuties. So we're out of time, but I want to thank the production staff in here. They've been great helping me out with my lectures. I hope you have a safe trip home, and thanks a lot.